continue the account of Sir Charles Todd's extraordinary life with Martin Walker, who will explain Todd's involvement with the Postal Service. Martin Walker, a well-known postal historian, began accumulating stamps when he was 9 years old. With the guidance of a local stamp club and a collecting urge that was as much inquisitive as it was acquisitive, he formed a collection of stamps issued by the Australian colonies. 4 decades later, he's created many philatelic collections which have spawned articles, handbooks and catalogues, usually with a distinct South Australian flavour. Sorry for that delay, Martin Walker.
Good. Many thanks, Rob and Mac, for the invitation to come along today. As was mentioned, my interest in philately is an inquisitive one, and the opportunity to put right perhaps some misconceptions about the origins of the post office was one of the things I wanted to address today. But also in researching this particular talk, it's probably stretched my comfort zone a lot, and I could speak for 3 hours on stamps and very little on Todd's life, but I'm going to reverse that situation today and speak more on his life as the Postmaster General than on stamps. But there will be a few stamps in the middle there somewhere. The beginnings of the Postal Service in South Australia appear to have commenced with a casual appointment of settlers to collect or distribute mail sent on the few ships that visited the fledgling colony. These arrangements became official when Thomas Gilbert, the colonial storekeeper, was appointed Postmaster of Adelaide on 10th of April 1837. As Gilbert was the only postmaster in South Australia, he assumed the title of Postmaster General, but he was soon brought back into line by a lot of the colonists. Yes. Henry Watts was the colony's first actual Postmaster General, appointed in 1838. He was succeeded by his brother John in 1841, and he remained at the helm until his retirement 20 years later. Most of the facilities we normally associate with the Postal Service were established under John Watts. Mail services began to radiate from Adelaide, and contracts were made to provide regular communications by ship with Britain and the neighbouring colonies. Postage stamps were first issued in 1855, and a money order service commenced in 1859. J.W. Lewis, who was actually James Lewis, not John Lewis as was written in your notes, was elevated from Deputy Postmaster General to the top job in 1861. The 1860s was a decade of expansion in the colony, so infrastructure as mining and agriculture developed further and further from Adelaide. This placed a considerable strain on the government purse, and some economies were required. The politicians looked for every possible means to save a penny, and one of these was to amalgamate departments where practicable. One of the more obvious amalgamations was that of the Post Office and the Telegraph departments. New South Wales and Victoria had already amalgamated theirs. The government firmly believed great economies could be achieved with amalgamation. There were already many towns in the colony with separate post offices and telegraph stations. Whilst bricks and mortar savings were obvious, so were the savings to be made on salaries. The first salary to be saved was to be that of either Lewis, the Postmaster General, or Charles Todd, the Superintendent of Telegraphs. The government had a dilemma. The politicians gave Todd the reins to the new department and unceremoniously dismissed Lewis. The newspapers had a field day reporting this. The newspapers thought that Todd was very highly regarded and had enough work on his plate pursuing his telegraphic ambitions, which obviously were to the benefit of the state. The newspapers couldn't fault Lewis's performance as Postmaster General and condemned his unworthy dismissal. The politicians defended their decision, believing it was easier for Todd to learn the administration of the Post Office than it was for Lewis to learn the technical intricacies of the new science of telegraphy. Lewis's status in the civil service was later redeemed when he was appointed head of the Customs Department in May 1870, but the bitter taste of how he lost the Postmaster Generalship remained to the end of his life. When Todd became Postmaster General on 1st of January 1870, he inherited a department with 359 employees, 270 post offices, which in the year before had handled 3 million letters. He also inherited a half-finished GPO building, which is the nice woodcut he's showing there. Very shortly after his appointment, the Register lampooned his new role with a satirical but probably accurate sketch of daily life running the Post Office department, crisis by crisis. This was not Todd's style. He was occupied with planning perhaps the largest enterprise of his life. In order to achieve the telegraph project, And to cover his long absences from Adelaide, Todd endowed the deputies of his postal predecessors with greater freedom to manage the department. As far as the day-to-day operation was concerned, this was a sensible move, but in terms of guiding the expansion of the post office, it proved to be a mistake. When the new General Post Office was first designed, the amalgamation had not even been contemplated. When building commenced in 1867, the plans only covered the construction of the building, not the internal fittings. These were to have been done by PMG Lewis, but when the time came, he was gone, and he didn't even want to step foot in the new building. And Todd was on the other side of the continent. The job then passed to the architect, who travelled to Melbourne to observe the layout of their recently completed GPO and modelled the Adelaide one on the Melbourne one. Todd was still on the other side of the continent when the General Post Office opened in May 1872. After the euphoria of his telegraphic achievement had subsided, Todd had a new challenge. The business of the post office had grown, but no one had planned for the increase. The staff were overworked and the new GPO turned out to be poorly laid out. One of the consequences of the amalgamation was to place the telegraph office into the new building, squeezing the operations into the post office into the remaining spaces. The grumblings of the staff began to grow. When 2 mail robberies were executed with complete success for the criminals, the grumblings of the public began to grow and caused the government to act. In 1874, Todd and his staff were brought before a government commission to inquire into the workings of the post office. Todd then turned what could have been a disaster for his reputation and career into a triumph. Whilst the heads of all the various departments of the post office were naturally called before the inquiry, Todd allowed and perhaps even encouraged lowly ranked staff to describe their lot in life. William Chapman, one of the letter carriers, gave evidence to the inquiry to explain that the business of the post office had grown without a sufficient increase in the staff to handle it. Despite the new Civil Service Act allowing government servants 3 weeks leave per annum, the letter carriers were unable to have any holidays. There was no one to do the work if they were away. Chapman explained that in the 21 years he had been working at the post office, he had never managed a break of greater than 1 week. The inquiry received a similar submission from the staff of the letter branch, pointing out that they only have 2 days off each year, Good Friday and Christmas Day. And even then, half of them were required on one of those days and had a day off in lieu. The report of the inquiry dealt with 17 major topics. Todd responded to each and every one of the inquiry's findings, accepting full responsibility for the situation. As much as he tried not to use the excuse he was away building a telegraph, they did slip in from time to time in his responses. His plans for a reformation within the post office appealed to the committee and saved the day. Working conditions improved for the staff operating the postal services, and the services improved for the people using them. A new Post Office Act was drafted by Todd, and from this an exhaustive set of rules and regulations was developed. Move on, next one. As a member of the Philatelic Society, it's remiss of me not to illustrate the effects of Todd's workplace efficiency with the changes in some of the postal items we collect today. The initial change was just that, an initial change. Government departments used to get their stamps supplied free. In the 1860s, it was suspected that some employees were pilfering stamps and either selling them or using them on their personal mail. As has been often mentioned, some things never change. The Governor's private secretary was high on the list of suspects. To curtail this practice, the Post Office printed the initials of each department on the stamps supplied to them. Thus we have PO for Post Office, we'll do the next one, and ST for the Superintendent of Telegraphs, and my personal favourite is LA, which is for mail from the lunatic asylum. Yes. This required the setting up of dozens of printing plates for the differing initials and the maintenance of stocks of stamps for each of the 54 departments then operating in South Australia. In 1874, this practice was simplified by replacing them with stamps over printed OS. These initials were for on service, but some observers noted at the time they also matched those of the issue of stamps, Overton Sparks. When the stocks of the previous departmental stamps were being run down, requisitions for new supplies were occasionally filled with old stamps and issued for other departments. With all the problems caused by the private secretary, I often wonder if Mr Sparks was tempted to send to Government House a supply of stamps overprinted LA. Yes. Yes. To the next one. Penny postcards were issued in 1876. This was a direct consequence of the inquiry, which actually called for a town postage of a penny. This was a luxury that could not be afforded, so the issue of postcards was a compromise. One of the great economic victories for the post office was to allow them to charge for the carriage of newspapers. A halfpenny stamp, which was actually designed to be half the size of a penny stamp, was issued for the purpose. Do the next one. Stamp duty was introduced in 1886 to pay off loans made to the government for the state's latest railway projects. A special series of stamps was produced for this purpose, and they were printed in two operations, one to print the design and a second operation to print the value on that one there. A set of 12 values was issued, with the highest being £20, which in today's money is about $3,000. Yes. Given their very high face value, the stamps are understandably very rare. A set in mint condition now resides in the Royal Collection. It probably got there when the Duke of Cornwall, later King George V, visited South Australia in 1894 and was presented with a collection of stamps by the government. A collection, incidentally, asked for by the Duke's Secretary. And as he went around Australia, the Duke's Secretary asked every administration for some stamps, and they probably all remain now in St James's Palace. A requirement of joining the Universal Postal Union was that each post office had to send every other member examples of their stamps, usually overprinted specimen, which is an example there. When the post office prepared their sets of specimen stamps, they also allowed thankful collectors to buy them at the much discounted price of £1 per set. As a special treat for the members of the Philatelic Society, which was formed in 1888, Todd arranged for the latest stamp arrivals from other countries in the UPU to be sent to their meetings for inspection. Do the next one. In 1887, a series of postal notes were issued in South Australia, and these notes had a special connection to Todd, as the design was by his daughter Gwendolyn. And in fact, what's shown there is actually not the issued note, but one of the early essays that was trialled for the note's design. When stamps were required for the reduced letter rates when Australia joined the Universal Postal Union, the Philatelic Society suggested to the Postmaster General that a competition be held to decide the design of these stamps. The idea was embraced in a competition held which attracted dozens of entries. The entries were later sent to a meeting of the Society for the members to inspect. There was 56 entrants in that competition, some of them artistically superb and some of them extremely naive, and that's probably a balance between the two that's shown there. A full-sized halfpenny stamp was issued in 1899 featuring a view of the Adelaide GPO. This was the first postage stamp in the world to depict a post office, edging out a German stamp depicting the Berlin post office by just a few weeks. Todd declared that he thought the new halfpenny issue was the most handsome stamp produced in the colony. When the post office became a federal department in 1901, it could no longer allow its stamps to be used for state government duty, and the stamps inscribed postage and revenue were replaced with stamps simply inscribed postage. Note the spelling on that one. With Todd's permission, the now Commonwealth stamp printer, Mr Cook, also produced a new set of duty stamps for the state government until it had set up its own facilities to produce them, much to the alarm of their federal masters in Melbourne, who specifically told them not to do so. Todd may have had a new boss, but he was still a South Australian at heart. Okay. Despite these illustrations of Cook's work, he later became the printer of stamps for all of Australia and produced the first Australian Commonwealth stamps, which celebrate their centenary with a big exhibition in Melbourne next year. Okay. Returning to Todd's reformation of the post office, not only did it save the day, it also accorded him an astonishing degree of respect and affection from his staff. The esteem with which Todd was regarded is probably best illustrated by this portrait now overlooking the post shop in the General Post Office. It was organised by the heads of the department following a banquet marking Todd's return from England in 1886. Painted by John Upton, the portrait was paid for by contributions from staff. When presented to Todd on Christmas Eve 1886, it was seen to be a permanent memento to mark the friendship between Todd and his employees. That friendship was undoubtedly reinforced by Todd's love of humorous wordplay. Dubbed the Pun Master General, he claimed his first employer, the Greenwich astronomer Sir George Airy, was so called because he didn't have any bowels. One of the best known postal puns came when the residents of Orroroo requested a post office. "What do they want a post office for?" he exclaimed. "There are only 2 letters in Orroroo." Yes. 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 He was quick. Yes. Yes. By 1887, the department was returning a profit, and it continued to do so every year thereafter. At the time of Federation, South Australia was the only state with a profitable post and telegraph department. Todd attended virtually every intercolonial postal conference over 3 decades. The decisions from these were instrumental in establishing a place for Australia in the Universal Postal Union, and perhaps more significantly, the mechanism for Australia's transformation into a Commonwealth. The postal and telegraphic conferences through the 1890s did much to unify the regulations and methods used throughout Australia. A unified department was seen as one of the foundations upon which the success of a federated Australia relied. Despite his experience and esteem, Todd didn't always manage to sway everyone to his view. With the overland telegraph, Todd had made South Australia the first point of contact with the rest of the world. When the overland railway to Melbourne was opened in 1887, Adelaide also became the hub of international mail services to the west. Not only did this give South Australia commercial advantage over the eastern states, it also generated considerable revenue from transit fees charged on both telegrams and mails. To deny South Australia this advantage, the eastern states often used their numbers to outvote the state, and they approved Pacific mail and cable connections so they can get information coming from the other direction. Interestingly, in votes that South Australia was destined to lose, the colony's delegates chose to abstain rather than be seen to vote against a proposal with obvious advantage to a federated Australia. At the ceremony to mark the inauguration of the Federated Post Office in 1901, Todd drew upon his repertoire of puns. He recalled the time when the Governor of Western Australia, Frederick Weld, sought his help to connect Adelaide and Perth by telegraph. The Pun Master General replied he would feel it a pleasure and a duty to do all he could to weld the colonies together. Todd had excelled in this duty. When asked what the change would mean to South Australia, the now Deputy Postmaster General indicated the public should not notice any difference. Todd remained at the helm for another 4 years. In the year of his retirement, the department in South Australia had more than 1,700 employees and 700 post offices, handling more than 27 million letters. The telegraph system had more than 20,000 miles of wire strung around the state, which led Sir Charles to quip at the banquet honouring his retirement that the state was well posted. Yes. To me, Todd's role in the post office was largely an administrative one. Whilst he did not establish the post office in South Australia, he was certainly responsible for creating one that could run itself. Todd always said he was a servant of the people. Having efficient departments that could run themselves was something that certainly both Todd and the government wanted. It allowed him the time and freedom to be a servant of the people in more and varied ways. In later life, we find him in many diverse roles, ranging from representing the government at a conference discussing the eradication of rabbits, to presiding over a committee raising money for the Transvaal Patriotic Fund. Todd was certainly an example of the truism, if you want something done, ask a busy person. At the turn of the 20th century, he was instrumental in raising funds for the statue of the explorer John McDill Stewart. In the years after his death, there appeared a number of letters in the newspapers calling for a statue of Todd to join the eminent people of South Australia's history immortalised in Victoria Square. A century on, there's still plenty of room. There is also plenty of room in the albums of all the collectors among us to include a stamp depicting the great man commemorating all of his achievements, just like the stamp depicting his grandson being issued in 11 days' time. Thank you. Thank you.